Hi, and thank you for joining us for our session, Compliance Made Easy, Simplifying Your Approach to Privacy. My name is Kelly Hood. I'm a cybersecurity engineer with Optic Cyber Solutions.
And I'm Mike Green. I'm also a cybersecurity engineer with Optic Solutions. Pleased to be with you today to talk about privacy compliance.
Great. So today for our agenda, we're going to be really talking about the approach to simplifying your approach to privacy. So to do that, we're going to be looking at how to bring requirements together into one place to be able to streamline our approach. And to do this, we're going to use the privacy framework that NIST put out. So we'll provide an overview of that. And then we'll create a profile to document, what you're doing today and help you figure out what you can do tomorrow. All in all, coming together to streamline improvement activities moving forward to help simplify your approach. So there are many similar privacy requirements and controls that we're seeing coming out from many of the states across the US are putting out different requirements, such as CCPA that came out a few years ago. ISO also has requirements covering cybersecurity and privacy. NIST has control frameworks and cybersecurity and privacy frameworks. But one thing we see across all of these different standards and best practices is there are a lot of commonalities. Obviously, there are nuances between all of them having slightly different focuses. But here, for example, we pulled out a few examples of specifically related to data inventory or understanding what you have. So we can see from CCPA that we're looking at the sensitive personal information, understanding what we have, what the sensitivity of it is. ISO 27001 has requirements for inventorying your systems and data. 853 has requirements around inventorying, and so does the cybersecurity framework. But when we can look across all of these different places and see that there are those commonalities, it allows us to be able to bring that together in one place. And what we're going to talk about doing today is bringing it together in one place in the privacy framework. So here we can see one of the subcategories from the privacy framework is focused on that systems, products, and services being inventoried. And so, we'll talk about all of these different things and how to bring them together. And as we do that, we wanted to provide a quick overview of the privacy framework itself. So the privacy framework was published or put out last year in January of 2020. It does have three components: the core, the profiles, and the tiers. And if you are familiar with the cybersecurity framework, this may look familiar because it is set up in the same way. So the core really is where we get those key pieces of what should a privacy program include? What are those things we need to be doing? What are those outcomes that we need to meet? And that's what we'll be able to use to bring to look across industry and look at the different standards and frameworks and say, where do these things align and map? So the privacy framework, the core itself has 5 functions that we can see here on the screen: identify, govern, control, communicate, and protect. And these are all creating a hierarchy, and this is the highest level of the hierarchy that helps us to understand what are those things we need to be doing within our privacy programs. And as we break that down in the hierarchy, it goes from the functions at the highest level to the categories, and then ultimately to subcategories at the lowest level. And so here we're able to look across and see, what do we need to be identifying? And here's back to that example we were looking at with inventorying and mapping and understanding, what are the systems that we have? What are the data that we're processing? What is that sensitivity? And what do we need to be doing with that as we walk through these different areas? The second component of the privacy framework is the implementation tiers. And the implementation tiers are really here to help us understand how sufficient we need to, or how sufficient these capabilities need to be, and how kind of mature we need to be in these different areas. So they vary from a level, or the tier 1 from having a partial program, to 2 being risk informed, 3 being repeatable, and 4 being adaptive. So it's often often thought of as a maturity model, but it is a little bit different in that the tiers are not discrete, where you don't also need to get to be that highest level. Where in a maturity model, oftentimes you are trying to be the most mature you can be, but here it's okay to not be a level or a tier 4. If you want to only be a tier 2 or a 3, where you know that you have a risk-informed and repeatable process, that might be enough for your organization. But having this conversation around the tiers can really help us understand and communicate across your organization and others to make sure that everybody's on the same page with where you're striving to be. The tiers also have characteristics within each of them broken down across risk management processes, the integration of your risk management program, ecosystem relationships, and workforce as well, to help you really, as you're looking at what tier you want to be, to figure out how you would actually implement that and what that means in your context. Okay, and then the third component here is the privacy framework profiles. And this is where we're going to be spending a lot of time today in our example scenario as we look at how do we actually build a profile. And a profile is really a place to just document what are we doing today, where do we want to go, basically bringing together the core and the tiers and defining that in a central place. So we can look at bringing together our requirements from maybe our regulatory requirements, our business requirements, and having all of this information in one place, and then using the tiers to say, how mature do we want to be, how sufficient or do we want these capabilities to be for each of these, for each of the subcategories from the core of the privacy framework. Additionally, I just wanted to point out that the core has, all of the, about 100 subcategories, but you don't necessarily have to do them all. There's no requirement. I mean, this is a framework that was created to help create the bounds and kind of the structure for what a privacy program should be. And it really creates that nice structure as we start bringing together those legal and regulatory, compliance requirements into one place. But if you wanted to just focus on a subset of them, there's no requirement to use them all. Here on the screen, we can see an example where you can see the core has all 5 functions listed out. Our current profile, if we're looking at what we're only doing today, this example has that we only have things across identify, govern, and protect, but we haven't started implementing anything in control and communicate. But knowing that we want to get there eventually, that's our target, that we're going to be covering topics from all 5 areas, but still maybe not all of the subcategories. But that's a conversation you can have internally within your organization based on your risks and your needs. So finally, before we get into our scenario, we wanted to talk a little bit about cybersecurity risk and privacy risk, knowing that there is an overlap, and oftentimes it can cause a bit of confusion between, what is the difference, how much of an overlap is there. So we wanted to pause for just a moment to talk about it a little bit. That cybersecurity risk is typically focused on or associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability, where privacy risk is really focused on the unintended consequences of data processing. So that could reach or result in a privacy breach, or a lack of confidentiality, some sort of disclosure, but it's not often related to the availability concerns that would be more closely related to cybersecurity. So we wanted to just kind of highlight, as we're moving into this scenario and talking about the privacy framework and the privacy risks that we're considering, whether they're business related or coming as a result of a regulatory requirement, that's what we really want to focus on, is those unintended consequences of data processing. And some of the key terms that we'll be using that show up in the framework and in a lot of these requirements are included over here on the right side, with data being a representation of information that we're all familiar with. But a data action is a term that's used a little bit less common or less frequently, where a data action is really all those things we're doing with data. So that could be, collection, retention, logging, disclosure, sharing, it's what are we doing with that data? And then data processing is really a collection of data actions so it covers the whole life cycle of data that could be, all of those same things, but looking at, what's being done with that data over time. And then privacy risk is really what we're going to be looking to mitigate or reduce as we are looking at the privacy capabilities to put in place, that we want to make sure that we're reducing the likelihood that individuals will experience any problems due to data processing. So now as we jump into the example scenario, I'll hand it over to Mike and he'll walk us through how we're going to get started.
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I think that last slide there with the Venn diagram between the privacy and security is really salient here. We'll kind of walk through, really kind of forms the basis for sort of the discussion here. How we kind of leverage those cybersecurity frameworks, regulation, control catalogs, et cetera, to kind of walk through the example scenario that we have laid out here. And just as a reminder, as we kind of pointed to up front with the, you have different regulations. So here we actually pulled in CCPA. You'll notice from ISO and NIST as well. For this scenario, we're going to walk through more from a inventory perspective. So from a data inventory, system inventory, and you'll notice the CCPA as an example here just talks about sensitive personal information. It doesn't explicitly mention systems, but obviously you'll kind of need the systems to understand how the processing kind of goes through. So that's really what we're going to go through here for this example, to kind of walk through how you can use different frameworks, different alignments to kind of interpret and understand some of these more higher level legal requirements that different acts and laws kind of bring from a privacy realm, kind of align that to the privacy framework. And again here, so you see the ID IM-P. So really we're focused on the identify function for the cybersecurity, for the privacy framework. And so here you see an example crosswalk really across the different regulations. You'll notice most of them here from a cybersecurity perspective, control catalogs, different frameworks, and we have CCPA there as well. So on the left are really, as Kelly mentioned earlier, the subcategories of the identify function. And you'll see here they're broken down into specific statements or practices for really what you're trying to achieve for this specific subcategory. Next here, as I mentioned, you have the different regulations sort of aligned in a crosswalk fashion. And really here, there may be overlap. There's not usually a one-for-one mapping, but you can kind of understand the intent of a privacy regulation and kind of use this as a basis going forward to kind of understand where to start when you're starting to document your privacy program. And then the last two columns here are really the notes and gaps. So really what you're doing here is you're understanding from an inventory perspective, really what you're doing today, document any notes, any gaps. It's essentially your current understanding of where you are from a privacy perspective, so you kind of understand where you want to go, how I guess as far as the tier, where you want to be as far as the tier kind of meeting some of these requirements. So like I mentioned here, we want to do is kind of walk through each of these and kind of give a high level overview and sort of some examples of what this kind of looks like in practice as you walk through.
Right. And so this will be an example of a profile that we had mentioned before, one of those core components of the framework. That a profile can take a lot of different forms. We've seen people use it, spreadsheets is what we typically like to use. We find it's an easy way to track the information. And it's like Mike had mentioned, being able to map the subcategories to the other, regulations or frameworks, and then include notes and gaps. But we've also seen people use profiles or create profiles that are, pictures and graphics and or, pie charts or all kinds of different things. So there's not any one way that is a right way to create a profile, but this is an example that we like, and we wanted to walk through that with you and hope that it helps to see how you can really pull everything together and capture it all in one place.
So with respect to the overall, the process we're going to walk through here, so you kind of see, on this sheet here, we kind of have the gaps, notes and gaps kind of filled in. So we'll walk through each one of these in depth. But again, just, sort of an overall perspective, this is what we've seen kind of work well for organizations. So you have one place where you can kind of map everything. Specifically, if you're an organization that's using, the cybersecurity framework or ISO, you may have some of this information already. Typically the privacy may be driven from, compliance, or maybe the privacy organization within a specific organization or group, but you may have inputs from other parts of the business, that's IT or compliance or the cybersecurity within the organization. So really here, I think this alignment kind of helps form that baseline, as I mentioned, for organizations that sort of have that framework in place. And it's really here is just a translation into, what does it mean from a privacy perspective? Are we most of the way there? And really what those gaps kind of look like. So for the first example here, the ID IM-P1, it's really talking about systems, products, services that process data, are inventoried. And really, when we're looking at here is really kind of understanding what the inventory of data is. And you'll see here in the notes for this specific organization, it looks like they have a subset of critical business systems are included in their configuration management database. But it looks like the inventory doesn't account for all of those critical systems. And that's really, we see in organizations, you kind of want to start somewhere. So if you understand that, you have a subset of your critical businesses, business processes or business systems sort of inventory, that's a good place to start and kind of understanding that gap. And, even as a first step, that may be, align it to what the critical business processes are from, the business perspective. So at this point, you may not want to get a full inventory of all your systems. Maybe it is just focusing on the critical business systems. And again, here you're really just documenting what the current state is, so you kind of understand where you need to go from there. If it is, talking to other parts of the business, other parts of the organization, but really here you're just kind of understanding where you are, so you kind of know where you need to go with respect to building out this profile that we have here.
Right. And like Mike was saying, that this is, obviously this is not a full list of all of those critical business systems, what's being done, what type of database this is, what's all being tracked there. But one thing we like about this approach for capturing it and kind of this form, this type of profile, is that I always think of it like as an elevator speech. If somebody came to you and said, so what are you doing to, with your inventories? And you could say, well, we've got our critical systems are included in the CMDB. And, and you can kind of characterize it, what it is that you're doing without having to stop and figure out, where is the database, who controls it, what all is included. Because sometimes it's so easy to get kind of bogged down in the details, and knowing the details are obviously important, especially when there's regulatory concerns. But as a step one for somebody just getting started, sometimes it's easier to just kind of, sit down with a sheet of paper, write down what you know, and get something there, because it's obvious, or so commonly it's that starting with a blank sheet of paper that's the hardest part. And once you've got something written down, like Mike had said, you can go talk to the other people in your organization and say, what on here is right, what on here is wrong, what don't I know, and kind of get their input as well. Okay, so as we walk through these, so the next one here, we wanted to talk through IDIMP2. So this is kind of building on IDIMP1, where owners and operators and their roles with respect to the systems, products, service, and components are also included in the inventory. So like Mike had said, we had in that first subcategory, we know that we have a subset of the critical systems that are included in the CMDB. But here we're asking, okay, so now we know what we have, or some of what we have, but who are the people responsible for those systems, for that data? So so looking at, who are the people responsible for our example scenario, and for a lot of businesses that we see, oftentimes we know who the business system owner is or the technical system owner is. But honestly, or a lot of times the roles and responsibilities of those people are not often defined. And so that's what we captured here in this example, is that we know at a really high level who's responsible for this business system, but whether or not, we haven't actually documented what their roles and responsibilities are. So there's a lot of things you can assume as being the person responsible, the business system owner. But a lot of times having that written down can go a long way to just making sure everybody has the right, communication to know what expectations are, so that we're not missing anything. Also, the BSO and the TSO, they may have different levels of responsibilities or authorities, and it does vary across organizations. So having that captured for your organization and what is necessary for you can be really helpful with making sure that everybody's on the same page with those expectations, and can also be a really great opportunity to go back and talk to the different business owners and system owners to say, what do you think your responsibilities are? Because here, just looking at, like I said, with this is, knowing this is the elevator speech of, maybe I'm the, privacy is the person, if I've been tagged with figuring out what we're doing with privacy with respect to my organization, or a chief privacy officer, a lot of people are getting new privacy requirement or responsibilities added to their roles right now that may not have previously had those responsibilities. But being able to step back and say, what do I know? What don't I know? And being able to document that and just get, like I said, just get something on the paper for now, and then be able to find out those details as you go.
Yeah, that's really a key point here is, as you mentioned, with the responsibilities and really who's responsible for what from a business perspective. A business owner may own the data, but they may not understand the technical interconnections with different systems and things. So in a lot of cases, you may need to speak to multiple individuals, kind of understand the roles, responsibilities to get a full picture of really which systems are processing which data, what the interconnections are, and sort of what the impact of that might be as you kind of build out your privacy program.
Right. And actually, in leveraging and even looking back at those, the columns in the middle where we're mapping back to CCPA and cybersecurity framework and all these things, for anybody that maybe, might be documenting this for the first time, if you have already gone through an exercise, I think, Mike had mentioned earlier, you can go take that information from, if you've done a cybersecurity framework profile, for example, and see what did you write for IDIAM 1 and 2, or what did we say we were doing for CCPA, and be able to leverage that information here as well.
And so for the next one here, IDIM P3. This was really looking at categories of individuals. You have the examples here is, customers, employees, consumers, whose data is being processed or inventoried. And so in this scenario, this specific organization doesn't have any specific inputs or knowledge around, if that's being done. And you see the gap here is really, you need to evaluate, categories of data being processed for the relevant subject types. And, that's, like I said, what we're doing here is really just documenting what the individual organization was actually completing this exercise knows at the time. So it may be that, the organization does have it. It's just not known by the specific group who's kind of going through this exercise. And that's totally fine. But you're trying to understand what the baseline of your privacy program sort of looks like. For some of these, for this one in particular, you may be able to infer the types of data that a system processes. So if it's a human resources system, for example, you can be pretty sure that there will be employee data within that type of system. So, you could infer that, but it may not be a full picture. You could have, contractors or non-employees data that's also part of that specific inventory of data for that system. So like I mentioned, I think the gap here is really just to do that analysis once you understand, or when you see that you don't understand the full scope of documentation around, categories of individuals, really do that analysis on, systems that you can reasonably infer, and then kind of broaden it out from there. Again, probably focus on the critical business systems to really understand the impact from that perspective.
Right, that's a great point. Sometimes I know it hurts to write none or that you're not doing anything, but sometimes it can be, an impactful statement. I mean, maybe it's something you need to do, or maybe you haven't realized was something that needed to happen. And it always, sometimes it's always you try to write, something up that you're doing related to a subcategory or a requirement, which obviously gives you a great start if you are doing those things. But by walking through the exercise, line by line like this, and kind of seeing where those gaps are, it can also be really informative to be able to say, here are the things we need to start with, or the things we don't have anything we're doing. And so it can be as much as it sometimes hurts to see the none or a blank cell. Sometimes that can be really impactful and really you can get a lot of information that way, or communicates a lot. So the fourth subcategory here, data actions of the systems, products, services are inventoried, is focusing on, what are those data actions? So when we were talking about what are we logging, what are we generating, disclosing, sharing, all the things we're doing with the data, we want to document that as well. So in addition to the systems and the data that we have, what are we doing with the data? So here, and for this scenario, our organization has the system functions and data processes are documented. for critical systems in the systems requirements documents. So this may have been done initially for more of a functional purpose, just wanting to know, what is it that our systems do? What are we doing with the data on our systems? But it is just our critical systems. And so we've got a note over in the gap section that says the data actions are not documented for our legacy systems, which, may be okay if we don't have a regulatory requirement or a real driver. But in some, heavily regulated industries, or if we really know that we're processing, sensitive data or personal information that we want to make sure we are heavily controlling, we may want to be able to go back and look at those legacy systems, or look not only at our critical systems, but any new system moving forward. There can be a lot of opportunities there by identifying, what is it that we know today, and maybe a stepping stone to getting everything documented and all of those data actions inventoried. It's just that as we're creating new systems or doing new things, we're documenting and defining that as well, and then we can address the legacy systems in time. But this is back to that, you can take it back to the tiers conversation as well, as you don't have to be an adaptive tier 4 organization in every subcategory. It may not be necessary always. It really depends on your risk tolerance, the risks to your business, and those compliance drivers to know, what is appropriate for your organization. So here is where you can start to have that conversation with yourself and say, this is what I know I'm doing, this is what I know I'm not doing, and then we can look at those gaps and say, how do we prioritize? Where do we need to start? What do we want to do moving forward? At a later time, but just knowing, here that, for example, that I know I've got my critical systems documented because they were critical and I knew I needed to have this information, but the legacy systems we may need to come back and revisit. So just having that documented can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in this case, it may even be, as part of the action of, we just use that same process that we use to, document critical systems and just apply that to all systems. Or it may just be, for net new systems, we'll apply the standard going forward. And then, there's a different process to kind of handle those legacy systems as well. So again, as we kind of walk through this, you can kind of see where, there may be, things that aren't in place, but you can leverage current practices, current processes, and at least be able to kind of, as you look at things, prioritize what the focus may be. If the legacy systems are legacy and they're being replaced by new systems, it may not be as critical to kind of walk through that exercise. But, kind of having things on paper, like Kelly mentioned, that, have something on paper where you can kind of evaluate, take a look at, and baseline is really a good first step to kind of, as you build out your program and understanding, or even, augment and mature your privacy program going forward. Okay, so for this one, IDIMP5. So the purposes of data actions are inventoried. So it looks like here for our example organization, those system requirements map to the business process for the purpose of being data being processed. Where again, it looks like here for the legacy system that's not the case. And it could just be it could be like for several organizations where you've gotten mature processes over time, and they just apply to new systems as you kind of built out, develop new systems going forward. But you didn't go back and retroactively apply that to legacy systems. So like we mentioned for the previous subcategory, it may just be that based on the process or the sort of the position of the legacy systems, where it may not make sense to really document those actions if they're going to be replaced in the near term. Certainly from a compliance perspective, it should be something that you focus on. But if you have a roadmap of sort of how you're going to handle this going forward with, the inventory of the data actions, it's really something, this document will be informative, to kind of make those decisions and understand, we say legacy systems, if it's just one system or two systems, or we're talking about, 1,000 systems, will really be, really drive that conversation on, what the priorities will be kind of going forward to really meet these, the intent of this specific practice. And again, like we mentioned before, if you went through this exercise and you kind of map to, say the cybersecurity framework or 853 or any of the ISO controls, you may have a lot of this information that, doesn't necessarily need to be redeveloped or, reanalyzed. That decision may have been made already. It may just be the fact you just kind of have to, input that here until you just informed across your privacy program as well.
Yeah, IDIMP6 here is another example where we're not doing anything yet, but it's data elements within the data actions are inventoried. And as much as it hurts, yeah, sometimes you're right that we're not doing anything. Sometimes it's really impactful. But here for this practice or this subcategory specifically, we know that we probably should be recording those data elements, categories of customer information so that we can handle things like data subject access requests. We need to know what are those different categories of data that we have. Where is our employee data, our maybe our contractor data, and if somebody sent a request to say, hey, I want you to delete all my data, or I want a copy of my data, we need to have a way to be able to provide those answers and address those requests. And so that's where this one is. I think a lot of people will be finding that this is a new thing that will need to be addressed, because we're seeing this is a little bit less commonly done through other requirements previously.
So for the next one here, IMP7, this was around the processing environment is identified. You see examples here, geographic location, whether it's internal, cloud or third parties. And for our example here, we have, data processing occurs both on premises and in the cloud. And then looks like the gap is, it's unknown where the data is stored in the cloud, where it's geographically located. And also we have a note here that the inventory process doesn't require the environment to be recorded. So I think that last piece there is really key. So it's not necessarily the efficiency, it's just, the business process of how, this specific organization sort of inventories their system or their data. There hasn't been a requirement to kind of document where, resided both physically and logically. And it could just be, if this is an organization that, primarily had on-premises systems, there was no need because it was always in one, specific data center or on-premises locally. But, as businesses and organizations mature, you may move to different environments, include cloud here. So, it's just something, again, we're documenting what the current processes are and, so you can kind of understand where to build from there as far as, where the data resides. Specific regulations do require that certain types of data reside in certain localities or countries, geographic locations. So depending on the types of information processed, it will be something that the organization needs to understand. And again, focusing on those critical business systems should be a first good start to understand, these are the critical systems that, our business relies on. So they'll likely have the types of data that may have that type of restriction around, data locality requirements, things like that. So again, we're documenting what we know and we're kind of understanding so we can sort of build a roadmap and go forward to really understand, are there anything that, any additional practices or controls that we either need to put in place or that we may have in place and just move into the appropriate processes to apply to the specific practice.
And please feel free to add any questions you have into the chat. We'll be happy to address those as well as we're getting into the last example that we have here for IDIMP8, data processing as mapped, illustrating the data actions and associated data elements for the systems, products, services, and really just looking at those interactions with individuals and third parties. So what we have is we do have the data maps have been created for a subset of the critical systems. So we're pretty consistent that we've got a good handle on our critical systems across all of these different subcategories, but knowing that the data maps, currently only outline the systems and the expected data flow, but we're not handling or not defining those data actions or elements, knowing that that's a gap that we'll have to address moving forward. So we just, in this example, we pulled out, focused on one category from the privacy framework here that has the 8 subcategories. But really, you could see we quickly walked through all of these to capture, what do we know, what do we not know, where are the gaps that we think we see. But by just walking through this and defining this in one place, and maybe pulling from some of these other standards and frameworks and other exercises we've done, and having this together, it now creates that centralized place to help us streamline that process. And we can then, if we capture it in this way, we can hand it off to those different groups like Mike had mentioned, whether it's an IT team or maybe the cybersecurity team or my leadership or other stakeholders that are from the business that want to know, how are we processing data? What kind of privacy concerns do we have? And being able to clearly show here, where we know that we are doing things, where we know there are gaps, and then we can use this as a place that's kind of that jumping off point for for diving in a little bit deeper and figuring out where do we want to learn more? Where do we think those largest gaps are by looking in that gaps column on the right and seeing, where do we have, a paragraph of text instead of a bullet, or where have we put, none in on the notes column that we know we're not doing anything.
And I think, like Kelly mentioned, it's really, we started with this example here it's just one subcategory. So there are several within the privacy framework, but, really understanding your inventory, both the systems and data, is really a key or core component to kind of building out the rest of the privacy framework. So that's what we wanted to start with this example here. I think that's the exercise that most organizations will go through first to kind of understand, well, what do we have? What systems do we have? What data do we currently process? And then from there, you can get into the more mature, or I guess different subcategories to kind of understand, the processes beyond understanding just your inventory and systems. Okay, and here I want to talk a little bit about resources specifically for the privacy framework. So these are crosswalks that the community actually provides. So you can see the link there for the NIST privacy framework where they actually have these. So these are, like I said, provided by the privacy community. And we've listed the ones here, against laws, regulations, some against the standards, and then other frameworks you'll see there, like cybersecurity framework and even the 853 controls. We did pull some of these into the example we went through today, but they're really there for the community to kind of use as that baseline. So like we did with this walkthrough of the scenarios. So if you've mapped to some of these other frameworks, you're not starting from zero. You kind of understand where you are currently. You kind of build them in, and certainly, you kind of build them in, tailor them, ensure that you're mapping to the right pieces within your organization. But these are really here just as, informative, references and just help to kind of get started as you sort of build out and augment your privacy program. We also have some resources as well. Our resources from Optic, specifically the one there, the privacy framework crosswalk, which was the template. It's essentially a blank template that of the scenario that we just walked through. Therefore, for you all to use as appropriate. If you need to tailor and bring in additional controls, certainly use that. But like I said, we've used it with organizations. We find it helpful to kind of document that process, to kind of have that crosswalk there, but they're certainly there, and we have other templates as well for both privacy and cybersecurity. And then again, here we have the NIST resources, the privacy framework crosswalks that we just went through, and then also 2 use cases that NIST provides that provides additional detail, more in a text format, sort of what we did, how organizations sort of approach privacy from a baseline to kind of apply the privacy framework as they're just starting out.
So to wrap up here and apply what you learned today, we've got a few things to do over the coming, weeks and months. Next week, so you can identify the relevant regulations. What are you worried about? What applies to you that you need to meet, and start aligning that to the privacy framework using those crosswalks that Mike mentioned, or the template that you could get from the Optic website. The first 3 months, after you've got that mapped out, you can start documenting what you're doing today, inventorying your data maps and systems, getting that started, identifying your privacy stakeholders, and then moving on past that in the next 6 months, documenting your current state across the whole framework, really rolling out across all the subcategories, and then begin prioritizing your gaps and implementing capabilities in your privacy program to figure out how to improve.
Yeah, so to wrap it up, it's really take action. It's really what we're saying here. Like Kelly mentioned, there are a lot of things that, can be done kind of moving forward. Hopefully this will be helpful to kind of use to kind of build out as you kind of walk through building out and maturing your privacy framework. But yeah, it's really just to take that first step. It may seem daunting at first, but yeah, really, kind of start with what you know and kind of move forward as you build out. And with that, we thank you for, watching our presentation today. Hopefully, keep the questions coming. We really enjoy answering your questions throughout the presentation.
Thank you very much.